And I just called up my wife and said, I can't do this for 35 years. I cannot do it. I will kill myself if I have to be in a cubicle staring at a screen in silence in some cube farm.
Yay, Sandy! Silly boy.
Welcome to Entrepreneur. I'm Ryan, and today we're going to talk about our entrepreneurial journey. Let's begin with one little disclaimer right from the beginning. So, the entrepreneurial journey of our family has been primarily my journey. I am the one that wants this sort of lifestyle. I am the one who is pushed for most of our engagements. Nevertheless, I will point out my wife Michelle is my equal partner. All of our decisions are mutual. She has been both a passive participant and an active participant to whatever extent she wants to be. So sometimes I will say, I may default to saying my entrepreneurial journey because I'm the primary driver. But as far as the family negotiations go about what to do and what not to do, those decisions are mutual decisions where she has equal say. So when I say our or my, they are the same. So to begin with, let's start at the very beginning, in childhood. What sort of profession was I looking for? Like any good 5-year-old, 6-year-old, I wanted to be a scientist because I wanted to be a paleontologist because I thought Indiana Jones was cool and dinosaurs were awesome. So I loved the idea of digging up dinosaur bones and being a dinosaur expert. That lasted for a while. And then later on in life, around the ages of 9 and 10 and 11, I learned what a PhD was. And my father had a master's degree. My mother had attended college, but education was always highly extolled in our household. And when I learned that a PhD was the pinnacle, I just automatically thought that me getting a PhD was something that made sense to me. I'd learned enough that to correlate education with earning power, respect, those sorts of things. And so I had kind of formally, informally resolved within my head that when I became an adult, I was going to get the highest level of education in whatever field I ended up going into. So with that in mind, got closer to high school, and my voice is a little different now than it was back then. My voice was more interesting then. I received some feedback from a number of faculty that perhaps I should go into radio. I had a good voice for radio or that sort of thing. And I was a tiny bit dramatic. My personality here may not convey that, but I've been funny like at least 5 or 6 times. When I went off to college, my first major I chose was communications. I enjoyed speaking. I enjoyed public speaking. And so that's what my first selection was. This was 1996. That didn't last too long, though. The nuances of a communications major are pretty boring. As I thought, well, what else would I like to do? My mind began to harken back to some of the other professionals I'd been impressed by. My senior year of high school, I actually tore some cartilage in my knee and required rehab. And the physical therapist I was sent to seemed to have a really cool gig. That physical therapist, he wasn't a one-man show. I think he was the only therapist, but he had some other helpers, people with perhaps lesser degrees, assisting him. But the space was very nice, and he had a brand new Acura Legend coupe, and it was white, and it was gorgeous. And I'm a car guy. And so that really caught my eye, and he was a nice guy. He seemed to have complete control over his environment, and the whole setting was just enviable, I'll say. So that came back into my mind, and I'd always loved biology. I'd always been really interested in physiology, kind of sports mechanics, that sort of thing. So I changed my major to athletic training. And with the change to athletic training, that lasted for about a semester. And by then I'd finished my freshman year of college, and I went on a mission for my church to the Philippines, and I was there for 2 years. And while I was there in the Philippines, I had some pretty dramatic experiences. The area of the Philippines I went to was known as the poorest region of what was already a fairly poor country. And one thing you don't realize about congenital defects here in the United States is just how many of them exist and how many are corrected for kids very early in life. So a lot of cleft palates and club feet, those sorts of things. And I had heard of or seen, commercials for Operation Smile, or read articles about other medical missions or medical envoys where there was just, they'd bring ships to different islands or countries and stay offshore, but the ship was essentially a mobile hospital, and doctors would donate their time to come and do procedures that the residents of that said country could never afford on their own. And I'd heard of that and thought, wow, that would be cool. It would be awesome if I could have that sort of impact on people's lives. So after seeing that many defects for that long of a time, I thought I would really like to play a role in bettering that sort of situation. And so when I went back to college for my sophomore year, I switched to a pre-med major, which is not really a major at all, especially at my school. My school, it didn't have a medical school, but they did have a pre-med curriculum for people that knew they really wanted to go to med school. So I signed up for that pre-med curriculum and enjoyed it for a good long time. I'm kind of a macro guy though, and so once I got past some advanced biology and physiology, or anatomy as it were, Physiology 201, I think, was the class that kind of ruined it for me. I love muscles and bones. I'm not as interested in atoms and molecules and protein chains and such. So the moment the subject matter stopped being visible to the naked eye, I lost interest and had to do some more introspection. And that introspection led me to back again, considering this physical therapist I was excited about, and I had to think about what about medicine really appealed to me. And the more I thought about it, the more I had to admit that what was really attractive about that physical therapist was the autonomy he seemed to have. And at the time, my mental conception of a doctor, there were lots of clinicians that weren't in hospitals, and I hadn't been in hospitals much, so my vision of a doctor was someone working out of a clinic where they seemed to be kind of the head honcho, that sort of thing. Again, flavors of autonomy with high income, or at least comfortable income. So I had to admit to myself that as much as I would like to do good for people, my prime motivator seemed to be autonomy, and business seemed the best way to do that. So I abandoned pre-med, applied to the business school. I was admitted to the business school. Internet bubble 1.0 was well underway. That was all the rage, and it was interesting, and I was interested in networking, and so I became an information systems major. And that stayed true for about a year. I was able to obtain an information systems internship with Walmart Corporate down in Bentonville, Arkansas. We'll do another video on that. That's an interesting story. But while I was doing the internship in Arkansas, I got my hand on some books. One was Beat the Street by Peter Lynch, who was the most successful and most famous mutual fund manager all through the 80s, through the mid-90s at least. So I learned about stock picking. And then the other book I read was Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now, say what you like about Robert Kiyosaki in the decades since he's written that book. That initial book has a lot of fundamental truth and a lot of very good information. It talks about all sorts of businesses, but it focuses on real estate and the power of real estate. It doesn't talk that much about cyclicality, but has a lot of good information. So I read that book, and by the end of the summer, I had sat in a cubicle for a long time. The internship itself was the Information Systems Division, which was a relatively new division for Walmart. Walmart.com was brand new. And so Walmart had purchased an old aluminum factory that was as big as a football field and 3 stories high, and dedicated that entire building just for their IT. It was an odd building. It was something like, it was at least 300 feet long. And each side of that building, again, 3 stories high, had 3 windows per side per floor. And I, as an intern, had 1/2 of one of the windows. My cubicle had a titch of it. Despite me having a better seat than most of the people in the building, cubicle life was just not something that excited me. So real estate started looking pretty good. So I got back from the internship, starting my junior year. I switched to finance because our school didn't have a real estate major, and finance was the closest thing to a real estate major. It had 2 real estate courses, and I took both of those courses and continued to be very excited about potentially becoming a real estate developer or multifamily owner, one way or the other. Fast forward to graduation. By that time, we graduated in August of 2002, and the dot-com bubble had officially burst essentially in 2001. I was thrilled to have an offer at graduation. Something like 60 or 40% of my colleagues or cohort of graduates did not have an offer at time of graduation. And that was unheard of for the school. So as far as new college grads go, it was a really rough time. But the fellow that hired me, he was from Madison, Wisconsin. He had come to look for help because in 2002, due to the dot-com bubble burst issue, interest rates had been manipulated by the Fed and lowered quite a bit. So much so that at the point that he came to interview us, banks were throwing money at any investment that pertained to real estate, because real estate was it was stable, but with the interest rates going down, the values of real estate and assets, durable assets, were shooting up, rocketing even. And so things were very fast and loose. 9/11 didn't help the economic situation either. There was panic and uncertainty and these sorts of things. But the real estate situation was so bad that banks were taking 5% down, 10% down, because the appreciation rate was so fast. The fellow shared stories of himself and other people he knew in town actually financing 16 and 24 and 30 unit apartment buildings with zero money. As long as you could strike a deal with the seller, and the sellers had seen so much appreciation, they were happy to get out because they had just made a ton of money. So they would just let it go for a price, and then you'd get an appraisal back, and it would appraise for higher than what you had negotiated. That's how fast prices were rising. So people were able to negotiate these 0 down, 5% down deals over and over and over again. And eventually we see in 2007 that came to a head, that ridiculousness. But those are the conditions I was hired under. And that brought me to Madison, Wisconsin. And by me, I mean Michelle and I. We had no kids at that point. And we worked in that job for about a year. It was mostly property management. Some of the charm of that wore off. I did not get any development experience, but I still wanted to be involved in real estate. And by the time I should rewind. When I was in college, my freshman year, I worked for my uncle in his repair shop. Their repair shop was called the Mending Shed. I'm not sure it's still open now, but there at the Mending Shed, it was almost entirely my uncle's family. And it was his, except for his oldest son who had aged out and moved to California, all the other kids, and they had like 7 kids, all the other kids worked at the shop. His second oldest son was in charge of power tools and power tool repair. The neighbor boy was the microwave guy. His third oldest son was the vacuum guy. And the 2 younger sisters, one was essentially head of customer service. She worked the counters and was the boss of the cash register. The younger sister followed in her footsteps. And then the two younger kids were floor sweepers and errand kids and helping carry things out to the car for old people and that sort of thing. And so that was the environment I had the good fortune to work amongst. And the wife was there full time as well. She was the bookkeeper and helped manage inventory. And then Craig, my uncle, he was the guru, the source of wisdom, and he was the taker on of the really odd projects or the extremely high value projects where maybe somebody has a Tiffany lamp and they bring in the Tiffany lamp and because the glass needed repairing or something like that. Expensive vases needed reassembly. The odd thing that needs a touch of the master's hand, if you will. But that group, that family, and the dynamic of each playing their role, it was really fun to be around. They're a fun family. They got along great. And that dynamic just really appealed to me, that you could make a livelihood in harmony and continuously with your wife and kids around you. I had the opposite, not in an emotional way, but opposite in that my father worked his entire professional life at a Department of Energy site in Idaho. He's a chemical engineer, and he spent his life working on spent naval fuel, nuclear fuel from naval submarines, which is not the sort of workplace that children are invited into. In fact, he rode a bus for an hour out to this desert location and an hour back. And so he was gone from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, virtually inaccessible. I don't know that we could even get a hold of him by the phone if we had to. It was an interesting situation. So work, and specifically the profession that funded our family life, was very much a black box, both intellectually, but also kind of emotionally. My entire childhood, we visited his workplace once. They did open the location to families so the families could tour and see what was going on where their parents worked. But it was certainly nothing like this repair facility that my uncle had. And so with that conception in mind, I had dreamed up how glorious it would be to become a home builder. Not necessarily being a carpenter, but to GC spec homes or develop home subdivisions and have my high school kids on site, or even the elementary kids, sweeping stuff up, and us just kind of being all together. And that's what I wanted. So when I left that first job, I actually stayed a little bit unemployed at the time. I had a lot of research to do since I didn't get experience in construction or development professionally at that point in time. I was reading, and this was where we took our first actual leap and risk as wannabe entrepreneurs. So I wanted to build a spec home. My wife had a job with a biotech firm at the time, so she had the regular job. I was studying books on how to build a spec home. Eventually, we had amassed enough savings that we could pull the trigger on that, and so we purchased a lot in a distant suburb of Madison. It was about a 45-minute drive away, and we purchased a lot for $39,500. The plan was we would build a spec home, and for those of you, spec is just short for speculative. It just means you're trying to build a house that we don't have a buyer for yet. You build it without a buyer, and then you assume that some buyer will buy it from you eventually. And so that was the plan. And we thought we were mitigating enough of the risk in that the plan was to build a home that we ourselves could afford to live in, such that if it took much longer than we anticipated to sell the home, that we could just move there and live in it and just have it for sale while we lived in it. And then we'd move out and take the proceeds and build the next spec home. And that would have been fine if all my other assumptions were accurate. Unfortunately, they weren't. Turns out when you cross from the west side of the Mississippi River to the east side of the Mississippi River, the cultural schemes of taxation, specifically how real estate is taxed, are quite different. So I grew up on a farm that was 80 acres. My father had purchased the farm from his dad because his dad basically made him. And the result of that was that my father owned his house, and they lived right next door to each other. So my father had this 80-acre farm with two large farm houses on it, 4-bed, 2-bath, 2,400 square foot homes, two of them, with this 80-acre parcel. And as I was doing my pro forma for how to construct this spec home, I knew there was real estate taxes. And so I called my dad up and I said, what are taxes on the farm? And he said the taxes on the farm were $1,200 a year. So the lot we had purchased was about a third of an acre in a subdivision. It was not a rural subdivision. It was within the village, but it was a curious subdivision where it had curb and gutter, but it did not have sidewalks. So this lot I owned at this point, I obtained a loan for it. I only put down like $5,000 to buy this $39,500 lot. Because the numbers were so small, there wasn't underwriting for purchasing the loan. It wasn't until I went to a bank for subsequent financing of the actual construction of the spec home. So I went for construction financing for it, and the underwriting that the bank did at that time included property taxes and the full cost of ownership. And the numbers that the bank came up with were far different than my numbers. I had expected to be able to build this home for about $120,000 to $130,000 in costs and value of $169,000. The bank agreed with that estimate. However, the bank also said that here is the cost for the mortgage, right? The principal, the interest rate, insurance, and property taxes. And their monthly payment estimate was $400 a month higher than my estimate. And that's because of the taxation difference. So in Idaho, the taxes on my dad's farm were less than 1%. But in the city of Dodgeville, in Wisconsin, the tax rate was 2.4%. That difference in monthly cost was equivalent to $40,000 of borrowing cost, which meant I had $400,000 worth of interest equivalent beyond what I had expected to pay. So I had to either borrow $40,000 less for my economics to work or get wealthier. So the deal died. And if I had known what I didn't know, I could have understood that deal was dead before I had even started, because I didn't understand the terrain or the realities of the microeconomic climate for where I was living. I was new to the area. I'd only lived there for only about a year. And in all my conversations, it had never come up. It had never occurred to me that the taxation for the same type of thing would be so different in different geological areas, or geographical areas, I guess you'd say. So that was my first entrepreneurial failure, which was underestimating property taxes. So the other downside of that, so that failure was larger than just being unable to start. It was also difficult to unload that burden. So I actually ended up owning that lot for just over 2 years. I purchased it for $39,500 and sold it for like $34,000 $3,900 or $34,750. So there was $1,200 per year of property tax just on the vacant lot each year. There was also mowing costs. I received several fines from the city because I was not mowing. It was an hour from where we lived, and I didn't own a lawnmower because we were renting an apartment unit. So I would just let the city bill me the $250 or $500 every other month to mow my lot for me, and then all the interest costs associated with the loan on that. And so that loan was $34,000 at the beginning. In the end, on the tax returns, I had a $15,000 carry forward loss, capital loss carry forward to apply to my taxes if I ever had the same investment sort of income to offset. And I think it took me 7 years to get in a situation where before that was actually all burned off. So that was experience number one. After the failure of the spec home lot, I needed to regroup. We had burned through quite a bit of funds with the losses from that and also from my underemployment during that time period. Now, for much of the time that we did own the lot, I did have a job, but it was the job that I talk about in one of my other videos. It was actually a step down payment income-wise from my initial job that moved us to Madison. Also, by that time, Michelle had become pregnant with our first child and had given birth, so we had a daughter, and we needed insurance. So years went by. I had become very interested in wind power. I thought maybe I could leverage my real estate license into becoming a landman for siting wind farms. But I was really lacking a lot of networking and contacts for that industry and to make any sort of other transition. We had lived within our means, but our means were low. And what that meant was we were not succeeding at saving any money based on my income alone. So I entered the MBA program with hopes of making some sort of industry leap to a much higher paying job and something that was also interesting. And so what happened during the MBA program was I did get a job or an internship with Land's End, again, back in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, where I was once again brought to the realization that being in a cubicle 9 or 10 hours a day, staring at a computer screen is not my idea of a good time. And I'll never forget the day in July. This was halfway through the internship. I'm riding home in a carpool with one of the other MBA students. He also got an internship there. We were carpooling. And Michelle she heard me. She was very supportive. And she said, okay, well, you better figure out what that something else is. And so that's when we agreed that we would work through some business ideas, which eventually became the Child Care Center. So with Michelle's support, she and I came to the agreement that for my second year of the MBA program, I was going to work through 3 different business plans, and whichever business plan seemed to be the best, that's the one that we would pull the trigger on, either as soon as possible or on graduation or whenever it made sense. And what floated to the top was the notion of a Spanish immersion child care center. At the time, nothing like that existed in Madison within the child care scene at a commercial level. We did a lot of primary research, which was great advice, and that's my advice to any of you. Many people starting businesses don't actually engage in primary research. Maybe you're questioning, what is primary research? Primary research is actually engaging with your target customers directly, in person, if not in person, at least directly. Primary research has no filter between you and the customer. You can read summaries and surveys and academic papers about certain groups of people or business journals about how a certain group of people behaves or what is predicted for the needs for a certain type of consumer. But if you haven't actually engaged with a representative or many representatives of your intended customer base, you aren't really informed about the market. And so we made sure not to make that mistake, and we engaged with our target base. One of the things we did was we posted surveys in a lot of key bulletin boards across town where we knew young, well-to-do mothers essentially shopped. And so we had, I want to say we had 130 responses to that survey. And that survey was not an easy survey. It had something like 13 questions asking about what are your childcare needs, what are your childcare wants, if this was offered, is this something you would sign up for, that sort of thing. So this was 2009. I graduated from the program in 2009. We did that research for Cultured Kids essentially from about October through April. And in April, we had our final, it actually became my capstone project for one of my entrepreneurship classes, which was great because I was actually working on my business as my schoolwork and getting credit for it at the same time. And then come graduation, we had to make it happen. And as of graduation, we actually didn't know how we'd make it happen. So to talk about this concept a little bit more, Cultured Kids, which was the name of our childcare center or our concept. We didn't have any money. In fact, we were absolutely destitute by that time. I had taken out some other student loans. By that time, our net worth was the lowest it had ever been. I'd borrowed about something like $28,000 to get through that MBA program. The tuition itself wasn't that high. It was quite affordable. We had in-state tuition, and UW-Madison is a state school. So tuition was something like $5,000 a semester, $10,000 a year. But by that time, we had our first two kids. Our second child was born in April, and I started the MBA program the next August in 2007. So we had two kids, no income really to speak of. And at graduation, we had even less income. And so part of the entrepreneurship program as it was then in 2009 was that specific specialization within the school had an advisory board. And the advisory board actually had an entrepreneur investment fund that was funded by wealthy alumni. And when you presented your final business plans as your capstone project, you had the opportunity to solicit investment from this fund if you so choose. And so I did, in my final presentation, I did ask for investment. It was called WAVE, and I don't remember what the acronym WAVE stood for, but I solicited that. And I'll go into more detail on that in maybe a more specific video. But they offered me $50,000 to help seed investment for our Cultured Kids concept for a Spanish immersion childcare center, which would have been and was the first of its kind within the city. For the sake of brevity, I will leave out the whole saga of Cultured Kids since we ran Cultured Kids for 15 years. I'll make a video specific to that. Suffice to say, though, that we did end up with funding. We did not take the funding from the school. I ended up being financed by my parents with debt, not with equity. We received a loan from them, and we got that started. And then once we were out of startup mode, which again I'll talk about in a different video, I went back to work for Hovde, for the property management company I'd worked for prior to the MBA program. I had actually become irrelevant to Cultured Kids. Not entirely, but from an operational standpoint, I was mostly irrelevant. And so in order to increase our income and add more value somewhere else, Hovde invited me to come back. And that enabled us to have incomes from two different sources and opened more doors to more entrepreneurial tries. Again, I went back to real estate. The timing was important. Now, one of the things I want to focus on with this channel is replicability, because advice is only valuable if you can mimic what you have learned from this other person, at least substantially mimic it. But a lot of wealth making is one derived from luck. And sometimes that luck can be analyzed and predicted, and some luck can never be predicted. The luck here, though, was in 2007, 2008, there was the real estate crisis. I graduated in 2009. Everything was in quite a bit of upheaval. So by 2010, 2011, there were opportunities in real estate that shouldn't have been there, but there are all sorts of homes for sale, mostly lower level homes within the market, but definitely some higher end homes as well. People that were over leveraged should never have had a loan for that home in the first place. They all went into foreclosure. So a couple years into, well, not even a couple years, 1 year into Cultured Kids, a lot of the homes that were in bankruptcy were finally hitting the market. And thanks to my real estate training and experience, I could see, and it didn't take a genius, but I was able to pay attention to the market more than many people. I was able to discern there are so many homes here that are way undervalued that this is a no-brainer to snatch these and buy these up. And at the time, we still did not have a great income. So for our first entrepreneurial venture after the MBA, well, second entrepreneurial venture after the MBA program was I again went to my father and said, I'm sorry, I have to back up again. We actually were homeless. I forgot about this. This is part of bootstrapping, I guess you'd say. So for Cultured Kids, we did eventually flat out run out of money. We were able to keep the business going, but we were not able to afford housing. So we were actually living in a commercial building. My wife and I and our two children were sleeping in the employee lounge. Essentially, the kids slept on the couch. Michelle and I slept on a mattress on the floor. And we were showering at the YMCA down the road. Okay. So these were the circumstances when these homes, these undervalued homes, hit the market. I didn't have any money, but I called up my dad and I said, this is a great opportunity for someone. I don't have any money, but for someone with some cash, it's great. I have some rudimentary skills. Most of these homes don't really have anything wrong with them. If there's anything wrong, they just kind of need to be remodeled. They're not cheap because they're broken. They're cheap because they're foreclosed on because the person just couldn't pay the mortgage. And this transpired in every city of any meaningful size, right? So I called my dad and I said, I need to earn more money. I have time on my hands and there's tremendous upside here. Can we go in together? I'll do the labor. You provide some capital. We'll buy 1, 2, 3 of these homes and I'll rehab it, refurbish it or whatever. And then we'll rent it out. The market's not great to sell, right? It's not a quick flip. This is going to be 3 or 4 years. But if we can snag 3, 4, 5, 6 of these things, then we're going to have a massive payday when the market normalizes. And he was generous and was willing to fund the purchase of the house. And then it was up to me to bring all the dollars in to make the modifications and enhancements. It just so happened that as things transpired, we found we found a great candidate, a home. The previous owner had paid $176,000 for it in 2006, and we purchased it for $77,000 on December 31st of 2010. So I was ecstatic. We got this for a song, knowing that from a regional standpoint, there was $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of equity baked into this already. So it was going to be hard to lose money. So I was spending a little bit of time at Culture Kids, a little bit of time at Hovde, working for them part-time, and then a third of my time rehabbing this house. It just so happened that my mother-in-law came to visit us intending to visit us while we were living at the school. And I had just finished resanding the floors in this home and had fixed a number of things. But we were technically homeless. And so, to be compliant with childcare regulations, we could not have our mother-in-law stay with us at the office building. So we moved into this flip home that was an investment property. We moved in there and stayed there for the duration of her visit. And it wasn't a short visit. It was like 3 weeks or something. But when you're going from sleeping in an office building and showering at the YMCA in the wintertime and staying in a house where all the carpet's torn up but the spiky carpet tacks are still all around the perimeter of the room, and the shower's torn apart. The furnace worked. That's what was important, and the walls are all terrible. The outlets are all uncovered. That's still an upgrade from sleeping in a closet. So when my mother-in-law went back to whatever town she was living in at the time, we just said, boy, it is easier to sleep here than sleep at the school. And so, we just did that. That was the path of least resistance. And so, I called my dad up and I said, here's the deal. We want to live in this house. Can I buy it from you? And in the 3 months, I'd been rehabbing it, working on it for about 3 months, and 2 months at that time, I guess. I've made enough progress on the home for us to live there comfortably. And so when I called my dad up and said, this is something that our family just kind of needs, instead of the equity you have in this house, can we transition that to debt? Can that just be a loan? You hold the mortgage on the house. I will just pay you the mortgage and we'll live here, and I'll essentially buy the house from you at the stated rate. And so he said, yeah, that's fine. So his $77,000 that, and I don't remember if 100% of that was his. It probably was. That $77,000 that became our mortgage. And the tricky thing was with this deal was because of the dynamic in the market, if you bought a foreclosed home, and because the market itself had not in any way recovered by that time, you could not refinance it with a standard mortgage until you had owned it for 1 year, because you had to prove your staying power, because the market was so distorted by this glut of foreclosures that appraisals could not be trusted. The comparative sales were so erratic and so had such a large standard deviation that it was worthless. The appraisal was essentially worthless because nobody really knew what the sales prices would be if it got foreclosed on a second time. Like if it failed a second time, what would it sell for? Nobody knew how much of the equity in the property had true staying power. So that was the rule they came up with, whether that was Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or both of them, was if you buy one of these foreclosed homes, you cannot refinance it for any reason until you've owned it for a year. So that's what we did. My dad held the mortgage on the home for us for the full year. And then in 2011, early 2012, something like that, then we went to the bank and we refinanced it. And things were worse, in fact, still in shambles. But Cultured Kids had grown enough, and my role within Hovde had also grown enough that we actually had decent cash flow for our household. And it was awesome because we were able to obtain a 15-year loan with a 2.75% rate mortgage. And so our home, which someone had purchased for $176,000, we were able to refinance that away from the $77,000 mortgage loan from my dad, into, I believe it was $112,000 mortgage with the bank. And that additional equity paid off almost all of my MBA student debt. And what it didn't pay off was able to be refinanced into a 2.75% rate, as opposed to the 6.8% rate it had going in. And so that was some awesome financial arbitrage we were able to realize through taking the risk of acquiring one of these properties in a market where the market was being irrational. So that was real estate. So I'd had one real estate failure, one operational company at this point in time not failing. It wasn't clear that it was going to be guaranteed to be a success, but it was definitely not failing. And then we had a real estate venture where we acquired what was supposed to be a home to flip. It eventually became our residence. But the real win there was, the business plan around the home was sound, and it would have worked out just fine. It became our home. So instead of remaining a business, it became a financial arbitrage sort of opportunity. So my next three entrepreneurial ventures were similar. They were still in the recovery period, the post-2008 recovery period. So in 2012, so about a year went by, I found a half duplex that had also been foreclosed on. And I went back to my dad and I said, okay, I'm a broken record now. This half duplex is undervalued. It's for cheap. I think it was for sale. What I pay? I want to say it was around $80,000 or $69,000. Someone had paid $120,000 or $150,000 for it. It was a half duplex condo, really nice interior. It was 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. It wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't in a terrible part of town. But it was like, here it is. Bank of America has it, and it's just for sale. This guy's losing it. And so I said, well, the economics still make sense to do this. So Dad came in with a lot of the equity. I came in with the residential rental experience. I think some of my money was in there too. And I owned that for about 15 months. It went very poorly. Not because there was anything wrong with the unit. It went very poorly because I struggled finding a renter. This was an interesting lesson. So right now, this is being recorded in December of 2025. We're into Trump 3.0, his second presidency. Immigration is a very hot topic right now. I had the opportunity to rent that apartment to two adult women, mid-20s, maybe even late 20s. One of them, when I did the background check, and so by this time I'd had 5 years of residential real estate property management. I'd been renting apartments or renting office space to people for 5 years. And so I knew all about background checks, and I had dealt with very reliable and well-to-do tenants, and I had dealt with some really struggling people, some of them good and some of them just with all sorts of problems. Addiction, drunkenness, low ambition, active drug dealing, these sorts of things. I'd been involved with some Section 8 properties. I was well-versed in tenant screening, I guess you'd say. So I gave them a tour. They seemed ideal. But one of them, when I ran the background check, the social security number for that individual did not match the name that the individual gave me. And so I called her up and I said, hey, this is what I found. Just want to make you aware in case it's been stolen or something. Assuming/hoping that it was somehow a mistake, because I really wanted to rent to these people. But no, she just sighed and hung up the phone, which told me she was not here legally. She was employed, though, and her income was fine. She was employed at some nonprofit. But I moved on to other tenants or what I thought were other tenants, and really no other great tenants came along within the subsequent month. And at that point in time, I needed to find a renter pretty bad because it'd taken a long time to buy it. So when you buy a foreclosed property, and again, I think this one was a Bank of America foreclosure, it takes a long time for the bank to actually relinquish it. So you'll make an offer, but that offer has to get circulated. There's not just one decision maker. It has to go through this whole back-end office process that the bank has. So you make an offer and you won't hear back from the bank for 2 or at least at that point in time. There's a huge volume. It's probably not the same today. But you wouldn't hear back for 2 or 3 weeks just for one aspect of the negotiation. So you'd make an offer, they'd receive the offer, and it would sit in a pile. And you'd hear back 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, and they'd say yes or no. They'd counter back at something, and you'd reply within 2 days, and then it'd be another 2 or 3 weeks before they'd get back to you. So just because you were striking while the iron was hot did not mean that the process was fast. So I think I had found this in June or July, and we weren't actually able to close on it and take possession of it till late August, early September. Madison is a college-driven town, and so the renting season is August. If you don't have your place rented by September 15th, you've missed the window, and we had missed the window. Not because we didn't know what to do, but because we just didn't have possession of the property to be able to sign a lease and say, yes, you can live here, because we didn't have control of the property. So that's a risk you take in this sort of thing. So eventually we got the property, trying to rent it to people, but everyone who was in transition had found the housing they needed. The only people that were in transition were people that were mostly in crisis. So I had turned down this couple of women, these 2 roommates, left myself in a lurch. Eventually, a single mom came along with like 3 teenage girls. They needed some subsidies. I had no other tenants on the table, and so I rented to them. And unfortunately, it did not go well. They were extremely irresponsible in how they handled the property. Snow removal was their responsibility. They didn't do anything to remove snow. The porch became fully iced over in the winter. They had slipped on it and were angry at me, even though it was their responsibility to clean it. So much marijuana in the house. There's always clouds of it whenever I go to visit. I didn't have anyone else to rent to, though, but then they ceased making their payments. So it was, from a rental standpoint, it was a fiasco. So I had to evict them, which was also a difficult process. They were not, when they finally left, This is how it went. When they finally left, this was maybe April, maybe March. It wasn't warm yet. But when they finally vacated the unit, after about 6 months of being there, they left all the windows open and had the AC turned on, set on high. That's how much they loved me. So that was not fun. I was able to get that on the market. The market had recovered enough. I sold that. I did make money on that deal. I think I sold it for $112,000 or $115,000. So we had some equity there that we came out with. I was able to roll that equity into another underperforming asset that I had found, also a bank sale. And this time it was a larger commercial property. And concurrently, I had received several promotions at work there with Hovde. My income had escalated quite a bit. And Culture Kids' cash flow had also improved substantially. So we had much more liquidity in our personal accounts. We were still living in the little house that I was rehabbing in the off hours. Real estate entrepreneurial endeavor number 3 was a commercial building. And so this was a 22,000 square foot commercial building that sat at the crossroads of a retail corridor where a retail corridor morphed into an industrial park. So it was right at the border. So it was an industrial building, but it had non-industrial tenants, if that makes sense. We had found it because the landlord had gone bankrupt, and one of the largest tenants was a competing childcare center. And we had learned about it through some parents that were patrons of this childcare center. They had sent out a plea because the childcare center was going to get evicted because the building was in foreclosure. And the lawyer who was doing the liquidating was going to evict this particular childcare center because the woman who was running it was an angel of a woman. She was running her childcare as a ministry, essentially. She had like 100 kids enrolled, but she was undercharging for everything because she was doing childcare for the right reasons, helping families. But she was not a good businesswoman. So her expenses had exceeded her revenues, and she was behind on rent. So the person liquidating it was going to evict her. And so we heard about this on the news, and we thought, oh, well, if this place is in financial trouble, this might be an expansion opportunity for our childcare center. Maybe I can get a talk with them and I can buy that childcare center, save them from their woes, and these families won't lose care. I thought that'd work out well. So I made an appointment with the childcare owner and talked to them and said, hey, are you interested in selling to us? I can pay you a fair price, maybe even more than a fair price, given your circumstances, and your employees can keep their jobs and the parents can keep their care. And they said, no, I don't really want to do that. And it's not so much, yes, we're behind on rent, but the problem is the building, we feel shafted by the landlord because the landlord is losing the building because of it was addiction or gambling debts or something. The building had problems, and that made their job hard. So in that discussion, they said, it would help us if you would buy the building and become the landlord, which I knew how to do. That was my whole professional experience up to that point. Post-college was real estate-related endeavors. Then I contacted the lady who was threatening to evict them, and she said, well, here's the broker I'm using. The building is for sale. And this is a 22,000 square foot building that had a fire in it just the year before. Like 90% of the interior was all brand new. 90% of the roof was all brand new. It was actually in good shape. The tenant situation and some of the maintenance practices were not going well because of the landlord having personal issues. But overall, it was actually quite a nice structure. And so it was being marketed for $800,000, and it had I think a 2.2 acre lot. It Maybe it was 1.8. So it had the childcare center occupied about 60% of the building, and then there were some hair salons and miscellaneous offices and things like that. We ended up negotiating for that. I was able to buy that for $600,000 because of the nature of the building. My trained eye, I knew that a building this large in this good of condition would appraise for something above what the asking price was. Now, it's in foreclosure, so of course the asking price is below market value. When something's in foreclosure, nobody wants to own it. They just need it to go away at the best price possible. For my loan, I knew the appraisal would be higher than what I was going to pay for it. And that's, anytime you're in that circumstance, that's a great circumstance because that's instant equity you don't have to come up with out of pocket. The sales price ended up being $600,000. The appraisal, I believe, was $890,000 or $900,000, something along those lines. The net result was I only had to come up with $10,000 out of pocket equity to buy this building. We put up the half duplex condominium as additional collateral on the loan because that was for sale at the same time. It just hadn't sold yet. That was for sale, and the bank said, because you're still relatively poor and don't have a lot of resources, we're going to honor the appraisal, which shows that there is equity here. We're going to ask for $10,000 cash now from you, and then you agree to roll all of your equity from this condo once you sell this condo to pay down the principal of the loan. I said, that's perfect. That's great. Happy to do it. And I think we brought in, my dad got some of it. I think we had maybe $12,000 or $15,000 equity from the sale of that condo that we rolled into this large commercial building. We'll call it the Greenway building. I ended up owning that building for 7 years. I was able to adjust the tenant mix. It was not an easy building to live with. It was not an easy building to lease out. I should have paid $500,000 for it. I could have negotiated it down, and I should have. I thought I was getting a deal, and I was, but someone who had 10 more years of experience than I did at the time would have purchased it for $500,000. They would have taken that price, and then it would have been a much better home run there. The quick numbers on that were $600,000 purchase price, about $25,000 of actual equity put in. We had it for 7 years. I did 2 refinances to make the building better, more rentable and more functional. I think we put $30,000 into the parking lot, repaved. Actually, I had to re-engineer the parking lot because it didn't drain well. So put in all new storm sewer features, added fire sprinklers. That was one of its hindrances, was it couldn't take complex tenants because it was not sprinklered. City of Madison prides itself on adopting every single code variation or revision that gets issued by any of the fire or electric sort of governing bodies. So to bring in, kitchens or nightclubs or restaurants or a host of other uses or dense occupancies, event centers, that sort of thing, we had to have sprinklers. And so we sprinkled the building, if for no other reason than just to decomplicate the building, right? If you have all the solutions on hand, then selling it makes it less complicated because there's fewer roadblocks to giving tenancy to any number of clients. So put in new sprinklers, did a parking lot, did a whole new roof coating. The roof was leaking in many places, added insulation. All in all, I think we put in $350,000 more of improvements, maybe $400,000 of improvements. We got it to appraise for about 1.6. I ended up selling the building for, I think, 1.4, 1.35, something like that. But by then, my mortgage had increased from $600,000 to like $1,090,000 through the refinances to fund those improvements. We had also added stone to the exterior. So it was 7 years of a lot of headache, frankly. But in the end, I walked away with approximately $250,000. There should have been $100,000 more on the front end if I had purchased it more correctly, if I had a better eye for its faults on the front end. But we came away with $240,000, $250,000 of gain from that building. So the ROI on that was pretty decent. So that was my most successful real estate adventure. And after that, we sold that in also late December 26th, I think, of 2020. So then at that point, I had quit Hovde. I'd quit my CFO job. I was employed, solely self-employed. That was my main real estate asset. And we had Cultured Kids, my main operating asset. We sold out of that building, which left me just with Cultured Kids as our means of supporting ourselves. That was for sale. Cultured Kids had been for sale since 2019. I had quit Hovde, my day job as a CFO. I'd quit that in May of 2018, essentially when I turned 40. I quit that job to focus on lifestyle, spending more time with my kids, and to prepare Cultured Kids to be sold. When COVID happened, all our plans were upended. It was the worst thing ever for our business. What I learned from COVID was if you get an offer on a business that is not spectacular, and there's no such thing as a spectacular childcare business. If you're trying to sell a business, a small business, and you get a decent offer, just take it. That market is so illiquid. You never know when conditions will be decent again. I had Cultured Kids for sale in 2019 for $600,000 for the business, plus whatever the real estate would appraise for. By that time, we had 2 locations. Cultured Kids had 2 locations because we'd begun looking for expansion possibilities in 2015, looking for other places to acquire or to put in a new childcare center. And we were very particular. We knew because of our niche we were in, we weren't looking for just a standard childcare customer. We needed an intellectual set, someone who really appreciated the idea of multilinguality. So that really limited the type of clientele we could chase. Luckily, one did come up for sale. It was a small center. We had looked at several across 2015 and 2016. Late in 2016, we found one. It was actually a house. It was very close to the university, very close to the state capitol, in a very up-and-coming, gentrifying neighborhood. It had been a childcare center since 1976, and it was both the business was for sale and the real estate. It was just a small house. The house was like 2,240 square feet. But that was another real estate opportunity. We could be our own landlord. Our primary location, we just rented space in an office park. So this was very attractive from both an expansion standpoint. We were able to scale a bit more and have some real estate to boot. We paid $60,000 for the childcare business, and we paid $300,000 for the real estate there. We ended up selling Cultured Kids not until, well, I'll leave you hanging on that. The package, both locations were for sale in 2019, and I marketed them as $600,000 for the business based on a 3 times multiple of $200,000 of seller's discretionary earnings, which was very typical numbers. And then I think I was asking for $380,000 or $400,000 for the real estate. So if you do the math, it was a $950,000 asks, or close to $1 million. I had a fair amount of interest. One was a young man whose family owned a lot of assisted living centers, and he was their employee, but he was looking to kind of start his own thing. And so he came down from Minneapolis, and he looked at it, he wanted it, but he was working off his own money. And so he made me an offer of $450,000 just for the business, and that I could hold the real estate. It's not that he wasn't interested in it, he just didn't have the funds. I thought I was a shrewd negotiator. I thought I knew what I had. I thought, no, I'm going to hold out for something better. This young man, he made that offer in, I want to say, August of 2019. I didn't have very many showings after that. I'd had probably 6 showings before this individual. Then I didn't have any more after him. They just kind of didn't come. And I was not gracious in declining his offer. I wasn't brutal, but I was kind of like, that's sorry, but I'm not going to entertain. I'm not even going to counter back for that. This is a good business. It's got more. I'm not particularly interested in keeping the real estate. I really want to get out of it altogether. He did not counter back. I didn't counter back. We went on vacation late in the year, and then COVID hits. In April of 2020, our revenues went down 76%. We were stuck holding an asset, a business I did not want to run anymore. Frankly, that I despised running. I wanted out of it so badly. And up to this point, Michelle, I'll do another video on marital dynamics. But to this point, I'd wanted to sell in 2012. I'd wanted to sell Cultured Kids in 2014. I'd wanted to sell Cultured Kids in 2015. I was done with childcare not very long after we started it. We had gotten out of startup phase. It was up. It was running. I was like, I'm not feeling fulfilled from this. And we're essentially at stasis. So there's not a lot of value to be added here. But Michelle had stepped into the role of center director and was really enjoying the work. And so it was her job, and she was the one managing most of the crises there from a day-to-day standpoint. And so this was her job. And so, she had say, and she wanted to keep her job. And it's not that she wasn't open to selling it at all, but it would have had to be a number that nobody would pay, essentially. So she wouldn't allow me to put it up for sale until 2018, 2019. I had become disinterested in running that business for a long time, so I was looking for an exit. So when 2020 comes around, COVID hits. This is my worst case scenario now. Now I'm trapped owning a shell of a business that I had grown to essentially hate. And the vast majority of our net worth was tied up in the theoretical value of this business. Now, when you are allowed to operate freely, that value is real. But with the shutdown of COVID, there were so many restrictions, you weren't allowed to run it how you wanted to run it. And your customer, some of your customers just flat out went away. Others were looking for modified attendance patterns. There was so much chaos in our industry that values really went down. And so that $450,000 offer was something I absolutely should have taken. We didn't sell Cultured Kids until this year, till 2025, to a very nice couple. They're from Colombia. The real estate appreciated. We sold the real estate for essentially $500,000. It was $499,999. So there was a $200,000 gain on the real estate there after a 7-year hold. But the business itself, I sold it for book value. I needed to get out before I went crazy. I was sick of it. So we had actually expanded some more within the office complex of our first location. But we sold the business for $300,000. 6 years after I had received a $450,000 offer from this young man from Minneapolis. That's been a real rough patch in our lives, not so much financially. It's been unpleasant and it's been stagnant and annoying, but emotionally it's been a very rough patch of, one of the tragedies or risks with entrepreneurship is your business can become your prison. Now, obviously we could have shut it down and walked away, but when you put 5, 10, 8 years into building a business, emotionally, it's almost impossible to walk away from that empty-handed. When you transition from pride of ownership to bitterness in ownership, you actually only want more money from the business because of the pain the business has inflicted on you. But we didn't get that. Again, I should have taken the 450 in 2019 and been happy to have it and happy to be the landlord for as long as I needed to be until I could sell the real estate to some other person who wanted to be the landlord. And then we would have had more proceeds than we did 5 years, 6 years later. And I could have had a far larger liquidity position going into 2020 where there were buying opportunities in stocks. You know, how different would our family be if we'd had $900,000 of cash on hand at the beginning of the pandemic and sunk it into Amazon and Zoom? We'd have a very different lifestyle if that were the case. But you know, everyone has regrets. Everyone has things that didn't go their way. So those are all the main points for my entrepreneurial ventures. I'm still looking for the next one. Thus far, we sold Culture Kids. We sold the business in May of 2025, and we sold the real estate a little later. It was July 31st of 2025. So at July 31st, 2025, we officially became fully unemployed and fully free of Culture Kids and any other professional obligations. We negotiated the sale of Culture Kids. The negotiation was finalized essentially the end of March or very early in April. And at that point, I began researching other businesses to buy. Wanted a change of type of business. I became very intrigued and interested in trade-based businesses, you know, electricians, plumbers, HVAC setups, because I'm not interested in AI. There's a lot about the current economy that's scary and or unethical in one way or the other. A lot of industries I'm not interested in being in. But trades work is really honest work, and it's very difficult for a computer to do. So that's where my mind has been for the last 6 months. I have more stories to tell in that regard, but this is the gist of Ryan Palmer's entrepreneurial endeavors. Thanks.